Chapter 2 focuses on introducing this concept that we call a behavioral habit. So what we're going to talk about is the anatomy of a behavioral habit. Now, when we think of everything we do, all right, whether it's a good behavior, a bad behavior, there's actually kind of a sequence of events that happens from the moment that behavior is going to happen till the final outcome of that behavior ends. All right, and so we call this the anatomy of a behavioral habit. Now, think of, at a simplistic level, something that has become a learned behavior, all right, for you. So let's use a treat, all right, something like ice cream or chocolate or something that you kind of really enjoy. So at some point in your life, a stimulus was presented to you. That was the presentation of chocolate or the presentation of ice cream. And you ate it. Even if you'd never had it before, you ate it, and I'm sure it elicited a pleasant sensation. Wow, that ice cream is nice and cold, that chocolate is sweet, whatever it is. And the consequence of that was an enjoyable experience. And your brain, which is hardwired for pleasurable experiences, remembers that. Which explains why later in life, when you might be sad or upset or in some sort of duress, your brain says to you, I know how to make you feel good. One way is to eat that chocolate. Why? Because your brain is hardwired to say, hey, see food, eat food, pleasant experience. Well, you're now sad and upset. Your brain wants you to be happy. So the brain says, let's eat that food. That's why a lot of us turn to food as a source of comfort. It should never be a source of comfort. Food is simply to provide some sort of nutritional value, but nonetheless, that's how it works. So, having said that, let's kind of dive a little deeper into this idea of a behavioral habit. All right. So every behavior, all right, regardless of how it manifests or how it comes to fruition, always starts with some sort of prompt or a cue. Now, a cue or a prompt, sometimes you can call it a stimulus, is something that makes you consciously aware of a desire or a need to do something. Now, a lot of times these are intentionally structured into our environment, all right? And sometimes they can just occur, with no rhyme or reason. For example, you might be sitting at your desk working, and all of a sudden, you're not thinking about it, but all of a sudden your brain registers, I'm hungry, I haven't eaten in a while. How did that happen? Well, some biological markers in your body recognized that your energy levels were getting low, maybe it was your blood sugar, and triggered the appetite center of your brain that then activated a neurotransmitter that made you consciously aware that you should eat. So that was your prompt or stimulus. A lot of times, as I mentioned, they're intentionally structured. We might have a reminder. So you might have a calendar of events and remind you that at 10 o'clock you have this appointment. Could be you leaving a gym bag visible in your car to remind you to go to the gym. All right? Leaving something out, reminding you to put it away. So we always have prompts and cues. Now, some of them, as I said, occur spontaneously, some of them are intentional, and some of them are actually occurring beyond our control. An example could be you walk into the grocery store and perhaps you have no intention of buying bread, but as you walk into the grocery store, you smell, pilfering through the air, the scent of fresh baked bread. And what it does, it conjures up a experience, a pleasant memory that you've had, an experience that you had early in life where maybe that smell of bread was linked to something positive in your life, like a fun picnic with, your family. And guess what happens? That triggers a craving and ultimately an action where you might end up buying the bread. So that's what a prompt or a cue is, all right? Now, in between the prompt and the action, which is whatever you choose to do, the response or the routine that you then perform, there's what we call a craving. And scientifically, we say the craving is merely an opportunity for you to change your status quo. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're sitting at home and you're, at the end of the day, you're kind of, ended all your activities, you're kind of winding down and you're just binge watching a TV show or you're just kind of browsing the internet, whatever it might be. And all of a sudden you come across a commercial, and the commercial shows a person enjoying an ice cream cone. And that person seems to be having this kind of euphoric, enjoyable experience with this ice cream cone. Now you're sitting there kind of in an idle state. You're not necessarily in any mood or any emotional state. You're just kind of winding down your day. But what could happen is you see that person enjoying that snack, and in your brain, it triggers a desire to want to be like that. Why? Because I said your brain is hardwired for pleasant experiences. So all of a sudden you get a little bit of a dopamine release, which heightens the anticipation of what that experience could be. And next thing you know, you've got a craving. You've changed the status quo in your mind. I went from being kind of mindless and just idle to now anticipating the enjoyment of what that treat could taste like. And then if that craving is strong enough, it will then trigger the action. And then of course, following the action, there's always a consequence. Most of the times where we have an opportunity to reflect upon what we just did. Sometimes we call it a reward, it could be a consequence, it could be remorse, guilt, whatever it is. But it's something that happens after the fact. So if you think about it, all behaviors, whether good or bad, kind of follow this process. Now, if we want to shape a behavior, now shaping a behavior, I could be talking about introducing new healthy behaviors, or maybe diminishing, or worst case scenario, eliminating undesirable or bad behaviors. Either way, we need to manipulate these four variables. Now, the more we can manipulate them, the more effective we are manipulating each of these, the more likely we are to enjoy success with that intention. So let's talk about what we're going to try and do. Now, the cue. If we're thinking about it, if we're trying to promote a healthy behavior, then what we need to do is to make that cue, that stimulus, that prompt as apparent and obvious as possible. It needs to just stare you in the face. You can't miss it. We need to have that just there so you see it and it does what? Makes you consciously aware. So as I said, using the examples of a gym bag, having a calendar appointment, a friend showing up to go do something with, whatever it might be, we need to make it as apparent as possible. Now, by comparison, if we're trying to reduce the likelihood of an undesirable behavior happening, we need to make that cue as scarce as possible. Something we've probably all done in our lives. We say out of sight, out of mind. If we visibly remove those potato chips, where we don't see them, then we might not have the prompt or the cue or the stimulus, all right, to eat them. So we make obviously healthy cues as apparent and accessible and as obvious as possible. All right, so the craving now. This is one that's a little interesting because the question is, how do I change my craving? A craving is a craving, it's just a desire. You're right. It's triggered by this anticipation of the experience, which could be linked to dopamine. And it's really hard to change that. So one thing we start to do is we say, well, let's think about intention and consequence. If we can have some forethought, in other words, the opportunity to reflect or to think about the craving before we act. And how we do that is we take a moment to think of the consequence that can then alter the craving. So what we need to do is just slow down when we are exposed to that prompt or stimulus, rather than reacting immediately with an action. We need to respond. So we don't want to react, we want to respond. That means create a pause point, an opportunity to pause where you can think of the consequence. Because if you can think of the consequence and structure something important in the consequence, it might alter the craving, the magnitude of the craving. So for example, let's use a smoker here. The cue or stimulus is I'm angry. I just got into an altercation with someone and I need to calm down. The craving is when I smoke a cigarette, it gives me that inhalation, allows me to calm down. So that might be what happens. A person who is a cigarette smoker gets that trigger. So I got angry with someone or something, and the actions I'm going to smoke. Why? Because they reacted impulsively, knowing the craving was to smoke. The sensation of smoke or whatever it is going down their lungs calmed them down. We can't change that craving. That is the craving. But what we can do is think of the consequence. If they were to think of the consequence, now we could all say, yeah, tell them that smoking is bad for them. I think every smoker probably knows that. So rather than beat a dead horse, let's try a different approach. Maybe if they're around people, we can make them think of the consequence of the cigarette smell in your breath or the smell of smoke on your clothes. How does it affect other people? Maybe people that are important to you. We have to get ourselves and other people thinking of the consequence, maybe not the direct consequence like, I know smoking is bad for me, but it hasn't changed my behavioral habit. So let's think of other consequences that might have an impact. And if we're sensitive to our own breath or to how people perceive us when we smell a smoke, maybe we perceive that to be something embarrassing and we don't want to be kind of, called out for it, then maybe that diminishes the craving. So every time I have a craving, I think about the consequence. Maybe I might not be inclined to jump at that cigarette. I might think of another alternative or an outlet to vent my frustration. So again, if the behavior is something that we intend to implement, then we need to make that craving as desirable as possible, and vice versa. Now we talk about the action, and the action is pretty straightforward. All right, this is the behavior you're going to do. So what we want to do is, if you're trying to promote a healthy behavior, we need to simplify the behavior as much as possible. In other words, don't just make it an easy task, make it accessible and convenient. All right, don't ask me to jump through hoops and make something so complicated, because the more complicated it is, the less likely I'm to perform it, because you're reducing my capability of performing that task. So we need to simplify. By comparison, when we're trying to diminish a undesirable behavior, we make it a hassle, not a habit. We try and complicate access to that behavior. That's one of the things we do when we hide the ice cream or the chocolate or the cigarettes. It makes it harder to access them. We see this in studies where people have convenient access to snacks when they're at their desk. People that actually have snacks within an arm reach are more likely to do what? To eat those snacks. If I place those snacks more than 6 feet away, you have to consciously get up from your chair and walk over to that storage place. Maybe it's a cabinet or something. And that gives you a moment to think about the consequences so that you're not mindlessly eating. So we need to complicate actions when we want to reduce the likelihood, but we need to simplify actions when we're trying to reduce what we call the inertia of action. In other words, the capability of getting things going. And then we have to think about the rewards and the consequences. I've kind of briefly addressed that, but if we are trying to promote healthy behaviors, find a reward that is satisfying in our brain, not just, a dopamine release, but something that's meaningful and relevant. An example could be, think of a person who, say, works all day long, and they're trying to be healthy, so their only opportunity to go exercise at the gym is after work. But it creates a conflict for them, because by the time they get home, maybe they've got young children and the young children are already going to bed. So they miss out on the opportunity of spending time with their young children during the week. So what if the idea was, if I could be more active through the day, several days of the week, then I could shave off one workout without feeling guilty about it, because I've made up, let's call it the calories, by being active through the week. Then I could go home early one night of the week and spend that extra valuable time with my child. There becomes the relevant or the personalized reward, right? Make it something that gives them a strong sense of gratification. Now, we talk about these, but what we want to do on the front end, which is going to be a focus of some of the chapters you're going to read, is the idea of putting structure around all of this. People talk about New Year's resolutions. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, start the 1st of January. And ordinarily we see some pretty good participation for maybe the first 6 to 8 weeks. But then come March, April, a lot of people suffer attrition. And the question is why? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one big reason is there was no game plan. There was no structural routine here that was created. Because research shows us when people set goals, they create a systematic and kind of structured approach to behavioral change. Things that we're going to talk about through the subsequent chapters. We are more likely to enjoy success. So there you have it. There is the basic anatomy of a behavioral habit. And what we're going to be doing through the subsequent chapters is talking about each of these in different kind of contexts. But ultimately, if we're trying to shape a behavior, hopefully a healthy behavior, then these are things we need to manipulate.